Hi there, this is a video to show you the lean and mean way to do remote debugging on your ViPR dev kit. You can perform your debugging either on your desktop, off the dev kit, or you can even use this technique to run Eclipse directly on the dev kit using X11 back to your desktop. Either way, it'll work. And a lot of the rules are very similar regardless of whether you're using Eclipse or IntelliJ or whatever tool you happen to like to use. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to do remote debugging, so we're going to set up the ports for that, and then we are going to actually perform a remote debug on a bug, and we're going to hot swap the code to show you how you can make code changes while the debugger is running without restarting the services, without restarting your test case. It's just a really efficient way of doing it. And then finally, I'll give you some caveats as to when hot swap doesn't work, so that you'll be prepared for the little pop-up that'll say hot swap didn't work. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our dev kit, and I'm going to size the window properly so that you can see it. And it's going to make you aware of a few files that are in storage OS bin. Each one of these startup scripts has a -debug counterpart. So controller service has a controller service -debug counterpart. And inside of that -debug script are some additional parameters that are sent to the Java virtual machine that contain like the debug port that you're going to need to feed into Eclipse in order to be able to connect to the remote process. So those are important scripts. What you can do is manually, if you wanted to, you can just copy the .debug version, the -debug version of those scripts to the non-debug version. So in this case, you can say copy controller service -debug space controller service, and that would copy it in. Now, if you've grabbed all the tools out of the wiki, including the bashrc that I provided, then I do this already as part of the INS script. So in order to build your view, you just type build. In order to install the RPM and clean the database, you say INS space C, and it'll clean the database. Okay, and as part of cleaning the database and installing everything, it will install the debug versions of these scripts. So you're up and running. Now you may ask, well, every service is using its own debug port, right? Absolutely. So in order to find out which debug port that specific service is using, because you're going to need to feed that into the IDE, you just want to do a ps-ef on that service. So in this case, I'll take the API service, did a ps-ef grep API service, and I look at the API service entry. It's always going to be 8,000 something. So you just look for that. So in this case, I found 8004 is the debug port that we're going to use. Okay. So now that I know the API service is running on debug port 8004, I can go into my IDE. It's running the same branch of code as the dev kit is, so you know the code's going to line up properly. I can click on the API service project, and then I can click on the little bug and debug configurations, click on remote Java application, plus it will create a new service, a new debug configuration, and I'll call it API test. I'm going to give it the name of my dev kit and that port number that the debug is running on, which is 8004. And then I say debug. Last time you need to do that, because for that specific service, now it's going to create a debug configuration you can always go back to. Your IDE may switch over to a debug perspective immediately. In the case of Eclipse Neon, it decided not to do that, so I clicked on the debug perspective in the upper right-hand corner, and that gave me all of my threads, and it gave me my code. I don't have any breakpoints. I don't have anything going on in here, but at this point, the code is running within the debugger via the remote connection. But I need it to do something. Okay, so in this case, I have a bug in this new method that I wrote called print persisted object. It's in the database client implementation. So it's running as part of API service, controller service, and so on. And I'm getting this line here. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to print up every time an object gets persisted to the database, and I'm trying to provide a call stack as to who is actually persisting that data so that I can try to pick up on some patterns in our code. So what I do is I print up this persisting object. That shows up in the API service log just fine. But then none of my subsequent log messages, which are in here, are showing up. So there's something wrong with my logic. but I don't know what's wrong with my logic, and I don't want to run, I don't want to add extra debug variables in here, restart my service. I have another video where you push the jar file over to the dev kit and restarts the services, and you can run your test again. That stuff takes way too long in a lot of cases, and in this case, I'd rather just have an interactive debug session where I can hot swap the code and figure out what went wrong and then fix it as part of the execution itself. So what I'll do is I'll set a breakpoint here. You can set a breakpoint by double-clicking in the column. In my case, I have a key mapping set to Control-Shift-B. Okay, so now that breakpoint is set. I'm going to go back over to my dev kit and I'm going to run my test case. It's not important what the test case is. In this case, it's a volume create. And I'm also going to, while I'm waiting to hit that breakpoint, which will take no time at all, so I don't have a lot of time to do this, I'm going to tail my API service log, since that's the log message that we're working on. And sure enough, I've hit the debug breakpoint already, and I have my persisted object debug message here. So I'm sitting on a breakpoint right after that. As you can see, I'm trying to persist a volume object, but I'd like to get the call stack. So I'm going to step over. I step over the code here. And what I have here is if anything in the file name contains storage OS, I want to print that to the log file so that I have a call stack that contains things that I care about. Right? I don't care about Java lang thread. I don't care about the list object in Java and stuff like that. I care about our code. So I just have a filter in here that says if file name contains storage OS, then go ahead and print that stack, that part of the stack. That's really all that I'm looking for. But I can see here as I'm stepping over, I'm not hitting any of them. And I know some of these are storage OS calls in the frame, so I clearly did something wrong. Now, if I look down in here and I look specifically at one of these objects in the element array, I can see here that I've got method name, line number, file name, and declaring class. I'm asking for file name. Well, file name seems to be a simple file name, not an absolute path, so it'll never contain storage OS. I'm using the wrong field. So I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it while it's running. I'll change it to get class name. I'll make sure that it's compiling. There are no red lines underneath anything. And then I'll save the file. The side effect of saving that file is that we are now hot swapping the code out underneath the service, and the debugger is going to now execute the new code. And when it does that, it needs to reset the frame pointer back to the beginning of the method. And so it did. And so it's as if you never ran the method in the first place, but everything else is still intact. And as you can see, I'm now getting into the code that prints up the call stack. If I go onto my service log file, you can see that I got the persisted OBJ with the volume that I got before, but now I'm actually getting call stack entries for a database client. And if I continue to run this, I'll hit step a few times, and I go over to my log. You'll see I printed up a whole bunch more. So that is how you remote debug. If you care about continuing to run this code, but you don't want to be sitting at a debug, then my recommendation is you can either remove your debug statements, or you can go into breakpoint and you can disable them using the disable all button here. And then you can just hit the resume button up here. And the resume button, it'll continue to run your code, but it'll run it on the system. It still runs it in the debugger technically, but it is running your new code. If you detach from this service, it does not put this code on to your service on the dev kit. So just keep that in mind. So if you hit this button here that detaches, it's going to continue to run the process, but it's going to run the old code. At that point, you'd want to do that little trick with the ant build, Control-Alt-B, rerun your test case from scratch, and you'll have the code changes that you're looking for. You may ask the question, hey, I've done this save thing before, and I got a window that said that there was obsolete code and it wasn't able to do a hot swap. That happens because the code that you're in does not have a Java frame above it. So the calling method is a native method. This is going to happen when you're doing things like step when you're in a method that's called directly from the dispatcher, for instance. There'll be some native code shimmed in between, and that native call is going to call you. Like if you call into an RMI call, for instance, it's going to be a native method that's going to call a Java method. And Eclipse cannot handle swapping out a method that's called from a native method. So that's when you'll get your obsolete code. You'll notice the pattern if you do it enough times, and you'll know when you're in the code making a hot swap, and you'll say to yourself, oh, this is being called by a native method. I know it's not going to hot swap, and unfortunately have to fall back to the old method. But other than that, you should be able to go in here and make changes. I can, for instance, figure out, I can make a change in here to say, give me elements I dot get file name. So I can put this in here, and even though it's an unused variable, it still gets filled in. It'll still get listed in my variables list when I run, if I save this off. So you can make a whole bunch of changes and you never even have to restart anything. So hopefully this is helpful. Leave comments if you have any comments, and I will talk to you next time. Thanks.